There are moments in life when a single choice defines everything that comes after. For Vince "Razor" Delaney, a grizzled ex-Hells Angel in his late 60s, that moment came on a scorching Arizona highway when he spotted a golden retriever bleeding on the roadside. Razor had spent 40 years living by one rule: keep moving, trust no one, and never look back. His Harley was his sanctuary, the open road his only companion, and solitude his shield against a world that had given him nothing but pain. But when that injured dog collapsed just feet from his bike, everything changed. Most bikers would have revved their engines and kept riding. Stopping for a wounded animal went against everything his brotherhood had taught him. What Razor did next would shock everyone who knew his reputation. Could one broken dog really transform a man who had spent decades building walls around his heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of burnt orange and faded gold that had become Vince "Razor" Delaney's cathedral. His weathered hands gripped the handlebars of his 1987 Harley-Davidson Softail, the engine's rhythmic rumble the only prayer he'd offered in decades. The leather jacket draped across his broad shoulders told stories in every crack and stain, each mark a memory he'd rather forget, each patch of worn hide a testament to 40 years of violence, brotherhood, and betrayal. At 68, Razor carried his years heavily. His grey beard, streaked with remnants of black, caught the dust that swirled around him as he rode the lonely stretches of Arizona's forgotten highways. Deep lines carved canyons around his pale blue eyes, eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. The sun-beaten skin of his face resembled the cracked earth beneath his wheels, weathered by decades of riding through storms, both literal and metaphorical. The Hells Angels patch had been ripped from his jacket 3 years ago, leaving behind only ghost marks and bitter memories. For 4 decades, the Brotherhood had been his identity, his family, his reason for existing. From the moment he'd earned his colors at 28, fresh out of Vietnam with shrapnel still working its way through his left shoulder, the Angels had given him purpose when the world had turned its back on returning veterans. He remembered those early days with a mixture of pride and regret. The camaraderie forged in blood and chrome, the fierce loyalty that bound brothers tighter than blood family ever could. The club had been everything to young Vince Delaney, a lost soul seeking belonging in a country that no longer recognized its warriors. Under the guidance of men like Big Jim Torino and his son Marcus "Snake," Razor had learned the code: loyalty. Above all else, never rat out a brother and settle disputes with fists or worse when words failed. The violence had come naturally to him, a skill honed in the jungles of Southeast Asia and perfected on the streets of Phoenix. Razor's reputation grew with each bar fight won. Each rival club taught harsh lessons. Each time he stood unflinching when lesser men would have backed down. The scar running from his left temple to his jawline bore witness to a knife fight with the Mongols in 1983. The crooked set of his nose spoke of too many confrontations where pride mattered more than pain. But success in that world came with a price measured in broken relationships, sleepless nights, and a growing distance from anything resembling normal human connection. His ex-wife, Linda, had tried for 7 years to compete with the Brotherhood, before finally accepting that she'd never be more than second in his priorities. Their daughter, Amy, had given up trying to reach her father sometime around her 16th birthday, when his latest arrest made her ashamed to share his name. The turning point had come on a rain-soaked night in Tucson, during what should have been a routine debt collection from a meth dealer who'd been skimming from Snake's operation. The dealer had been young, barely 22, with hollow eyes and track marks, painting roadmaps of desperation up his arms. When he'd begged for more time, claiming he had a sick mother to care for, Razor had felt something crack inside a chest, For the first time in decades, he'd looked at his target and seen not an enemy to be eliminated, but a broken child who reminded him too much of the scared kid he'd once been. The hesitation had lasted only seconds, but Snake had noticed. In the Brotherhood, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness could get brothers killed. The confrontation that followed had torn apart friendships spanning decades and ended with Razor's exile from the only family he'd known since Vietnam. Now, 3 years later, he existed in a liminal space between his violent past and an uncertain future. The desert had become his refuge, its vast emptiness matching the hollow feeling in his chest. His daily routine had crystallized into rigid patterns. Wake at dawn in whatever roadside motel or campground would take cash without asking questions, check the Harley's oil and tire pressure with the methodical precision of a man whose life depended on mechanical reliability, and ride until the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The motorcycle itself was a masterpiece of maintenance born from necessity and love. Every bolt, every cable, every piece of chrome received daily attention. The 1340cc Evolution engine had been rebuilt twice by his own hands, its internals as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The bike's black paint job, dulled by years of sun and sand, bore no chrome accessories or flashy modifications, just a functional machine built for endurance rather than show. His saddlebags contained everything he owned: 2 changes of clothes, basic tools, a first aid kit that had seen considerable use, and a roll of cash that grew thinner each month. The right bag held his most precious possessions: a faded photograph of Amy at her high school graduation, taken secretly from the parking lot because his presence would have embarrassed her, and a small wooden cross carved by his grandfather, the only religious artifact he'd kept from a childhood spent in foster homes. The Arizona desert had chosen him as much as he'd chosen it. Its brutal honesty appealed to a man tired of human complexity and deception. Out here, survival depended on simple things: water, fuel, and the ability to read weather patterns in the endless sky. The desert didn't judge his past or demand explanations for his choices. It simply existed, vast and forgiving in its indifference. He'd mapped every truck stop, trading post, and water source across 3 states, learning the rhythms of commerce that kept civilization's thin tentacles reaching into the wilderness. The people who worked these lonely outposts had grown accustomed to the sight of the solitary biker who paid cash, spoke little, and never caused trouble. They appreciated customers who understood the desert's harsh mathematics, that courtesy and respect meant the difference between help and hostility when help might mean survival. The loneliness had weight to it, pressing down on his shoulders. Like the desert heat, 3 years of self-imposed exile had given him plenty of time to think, and thinking had become his enemy. In the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep eluded him despite bone-deep exhaustion, Razor found himself conducting conversations with ghosts. He argued with Snake about loyalty and betrayal, pleaded with Linda for forgiveness that would never come, and tried to explain to Amy why protecting her had meant staying away. His philosophy had distilled down to 3 simple rules: keep moving, trust no one, and never get involved. The first rule had kept him ahead of old enemies who might still harbor grudges. The second had protected him from the disappointment that inevitably followed human connection. The third had become his shield against the kind of moral complexity that had destroyed his relationship with the angels. These rules had served him well for 3 years of desert wandering, keeping him alive and anonymous in a landscape that could kill the careless or unprepared. He'd witnessed accidents, breakdowns, and travelers in distress, but his code demanded he ride past without stopping. Getting involved meant complications, and complications meant the kind of human messiness he'd fled into the desert to escape. The irony wasn't lost on him, that a man who'd once commanded respect through violence and intimidation now found his greatest challenge in avoiding human contact altogether. The skills that had made him feared in the Brotherhood reading situations, anticipating threats, controlling confrontations, now served mainly to help him identify problems early enough to ride around them. Yet beneath the carefully constructed armor of indifference, something had begun to stir in recent months. The desert silence, once comforting, had started to feel oppressive. The endless horizon that had promised freedom now seemed like a prison without walls. The face in his shaving mirror had begun to look like his grandfather's in those final years, worn down by loneliness and regret, faded to the color of old bones. As Razor guided his Harley through another nameless stretch of highway, the sun climbing toward its merciless noon peak, he carried within him the accumulated weight of 68 years, 40 of them spent learning hard lessons about loyalty, violence, and the price of belonging. The desert wind caught the edges of his jacket, and for a moment he felt almost weightless, a man reduced to his essential elements, riding through a landscape that asked nothing of him except the simple act of moving forward. He had no destination in mind, no schedule to keep, no one waiting for his arrival anywhere in the world. This was freedom, he told himself, though it felt suspiciously like another form of prison. The engine beneath him thrummed with reliable power. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and Vince "Razor" Delaney continued his journey toward whatever waited in the shimmering distance, unaware that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered by a chance encounter with Grace. The heat shimmer rising from the asphalt created phantom lakes that disappeared as Razor approached, a fitting metaphor for most things in his life that had promised sustenance but delivered only emptiness. Highway 191 stretched before him like a ribbon of melted tar, empty except for the occasional semi-truck hauling goods between forgotten towns. The sun had reached that particular angle where it turned the desert into a furnace, and even the Harley's engine seemed to strain against the oppressive temperature. Razor had been riding for 6 hours straight, his last stop a truck stop near Safford, where the coffee had tasted like burnt motor oil, and the clerk had eyed him with the mixture of wariness and curiosity that his appearance typically inspired. He'd bought bottled water, beef jerky, and gasoline, conducting the transaction with the minimum number of words necessary. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Cheryl, had counted his cash twice before handing him change, her fingers trembling slightly as she avoided direct eye contact. Such encounters had become routine, people seeing the weathered leather, the grey beard, the scars that mapped a violent history across his visible skin, and making assumptions about his capacity for harm. They weren't wrong exactly, but they weren't entirely right either. Razor had learned to live within these assumptions, using them as armor against unwanted conversation or connection. The mile marker ahead read 47, though he paid it little attention. Numbers had ceased to matter much in his current existence. One stretch of highway looked much like another, and destinations were just places to buy fuel before moving on. The desert here was particularly stark, populated mainly by creosote bushes and the occasional Joshua tree standing sentinel against the endless blue sky. That's when he saw it, a flash of gold against the grey-brown landscape, moving with an unsteady gait along the highway's shoulder. At first, Razor assumed it was a coyote, or perhaps a stray cattle dog from one of the scattered ranches that dotted this part of Arizona. But as he drew closer, throttling back the Harley's engine, the shape resolved itself into something that made his chest tighten with unexpected recognition. A golden retriever, its normally lustrous coat dulled by dust and dried blood, limped along the roadside with the determined gait of an animal operating purely on instinct. Even from a distance, Razor could see the dog favoring its right front paw, leaving intermittent spots of crimson on the sun-bleached asphalt behind it. His first instinct was to accelerate past, following the code that had governed his last 3 years. Keep moving, don't get involved, and trust that someone else would handle whatever complications presented themselves. The dog was clearly injured, possibly dying, but that wasn't his problem. The desert was full of things that didn't survive, that was simply the natural order, harsh but honest in its indifference. Yet something made him ease off the throttle instead, the Harley's engine settling into a lower rumble as he reduced speed. Perhaps it was the way the dog continued moving forward despite obvious pain, displaying the kind of stubborn determination that Razor recognized in himself. Or maybe it was the memory of his grandfather's old hunting dog, Rex, who'd been his only companion during those terrible early years in foster care. As Razor drew alongside the animal, he could see the full extent of its condition. The golden retriever was a female, probably 4 or 5 years old, her ribs visible through matted fur that spoke of weeks without regular meals. The injured paw appeared to have been caught in something, wire or perhaps a trap, and the wound had begun to fester in the desert heat. Her tongue lolled from her mouth as she panted heavily, dark eyes reflecting a mixture of pain and the kind of weary resignation that Razor understood too well. The dog noticed the motorcycle's approach, but didn't flee. Instead, she stopped walking and turned to face him, tail giving a tentative wag that seemed to cost her considerable effort. There was something in her gaze that bypassed all of Razor's carefully constructed defenses, a look of pure trust that assumed help rather than harm, despite whatever cruelties had brought her to this desperate state. Razor brought the Harley to a complete stop, the sudden silence after hours of engine noise almost startling in its completeness. The desert stretched in all directions, empty of any other human presence, leaving just a man and a dying dog staring at each other across a chasm of species and circumstance. "Well, hell," he muttered, his voice rusty from disuse. The words seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, and he realized he hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 2 days. The dog took a tentative step toward him, then another, her injured paw barely touching the ground. Each movement obviously caused her pain, but she continued, approaching with the faith that this stranger represented salvation rather than another source of suffering. When she reached the motorcycle, she sat down heavily beside the front wheel and looked up at Razor with eyes that held no accusation, no demand, only patient hope. For nearly 5 minutes, they regarded each other in silence. Razor found himself cataloguing the dog's injuries with the clinical detachment he'd once applied to assessing battlefield casualties. The paw wound was serious, but probably treatable if addressed quickly. The dehydration and malnutrition were more immediately life-threatening. Without intervention, the animal would probably be dead within hours, another casualty of the desert's unforgiving mathematics. The rational part of his mind ran through all the reasons to ride away. He had no supplies for treating injured animals, no money to spare for veterinary bills, and no desire to complicate his carefully ordered existence with responsibilities to another living creature. Getting involved would mean finding a town, dealing with people, making decisions that extended beyond his immediate survival, all violations of the code that had kept him safe and anonymous. But when the dog struggled to her feet and took another painful step toward him, something fundamental shifted in Razor's chest. The walls he'd built around his heart developed their first crack in 3 years, and through that narrow opening seeped something he'd almost forgotten existed: the capacity to care about another being's suffering more than his own convenience. "Damn it," he whispered, swinging his leg over the Harley's seat and stepping onto the superheated asphalt. The dog's tail wagged harder as he approached, and she attempted to stand despite her obvious exhaustion. Razor knelt beside her, extending one scarred hand slowly, allowing her to catch his scent before making contact. Her nose was warm and dry against his palm, and when he gently stroked her head, she leaned into the touch with a soft whimper that might have been relief. "Where'd you come from, girl?" he asked, though he expected no answer. His hands, so familiar with violence and machinery, moved with surprising gentleness as he examined her injuries. The wound on her paw was worse up close, jagged edges that suggested wire or broken glass, with infection beginning to take hold in the desert heat. From his saddlebag, Razor retrieved his first aid kit and a bottle of water. The medical supplies were intended for human injuries, but they would have to suffice. He cleaned the wound as best he could, the dog remaining remarkably still, despite what must have been considerable pain. When he wrapped the paw in gauze, she actually licked his hand, a gesture of trust that hit him harder than any blow he'd ever taken in 40 years of fighting. The water proved more challenging. The dog was so dehydrated that she tried to drink too quickly, and Razor had to control the flow to prevent her from making herself sick. He found himself talking to her quietly, meaningless words of comfort that seemed to calm both the animal and something deep within himself. As the immediate crisis stabilized, reality began to reassert itself. He was stranded on a desert highway, with a seriously injured animal, no veterinary knowledge, and no plan beyond the next few minutes. The nearest town was probably Millfield, a dying speck on the map he'd passed through once before, maybe 30 miles north if he remembered correctly. The logical thing would be to make the dog as comfortable as possible and continue on his way. Someone else would surely come along eventually, someone better equipped to help, but as he looked into her trusting eyes, Razor realized that someone else had become him, whether he liked it or not. With infinite care, he lifted the golden retriever into his arms. She weighed less than she should have, her body warm against his chest as he tried to figure out how to transport an injured dog on a motorcycle. The solution, when it came to him, was both simple and terrifying in its implications. He would have to hold her while riding, trusting 30 years of motorcycle experience to keep them both safe. As he settled onto the Harley with the dog cradled against him, Razor felt the last of his carefully constructed solitude crumble away. Mile marker 47 would forever mark the spot where a hardened ex-biker chose compassion over convenience, though he wouldn't understand the full magnitude of that choice until much later. The engine roared to life, and they began moving toward Millfield, toward complications and connections, toward the possibility that even the most broken things could be healed with enough patience and care. Millfield, Arizona announced itself with a sun-faded sign that optimistically declared population 847, despite evidence suggesting that number was more hopeful than accurate. The town materialized from the desert heat like a mirage that had decided to stay, its main street lined with buildings that seemed to be engaged in a slow-motion race toward collapse. Razor navigated the Harley carefully through streets that had seen better decades, the injured golden retriever still cradled against his chest. She had remained remarkably calm during the 30-mile journey, occasionally lifting her head to survey their surroundings, but mostly content to rest against the steady rumble of his heartbeat. The trust she showed continued to unnerve him. When had he last been responsible for another living creature's well-being? The buildings they passed told the story of a community that had been forgotten by progress and abandoned by hope. A defunct gas station with analog pumps sat beside a boarded-up grocery store, both bearing the sun-bleached scars of dreams that had died in the desert heat. Empty lots filled with tumbleweeds and broken glass separated structures that looked like they were holding each other up through sheer stubbornness. The veterinary clinic, when he finally located it, fit perfectly into the town's narrative of faded aspirations. A small, single-story building with peeling white paint and a hand-painted sign that read Desert Animal Care, Dr. Sarah Chen, DVM. It occupied a corner lot between a shuttered hardware store and what might once have been a real estate office. The parking lot was empty except for a dust-covered Honda Civic that had seen better years. Razor pulled up to the clinic's entrance, the Harley's engine echoing off the surrounding buildings before settling into silence. The dog stirred in his arms, lifting her head to examine their destination with what might have been recognition, or perhaps just the hope that came with desperation. The clinic's front door bore multiple signs: emergency after hours number, payment due at time of service, and no personal checks accepted. Each notice spoke to the economic realities of practicing veterinary medicine in a place where most residents counted their wealth in single digits. Through the window, Razor could see a modest waiting room with mismatched chairs and magazines that were probably older than some of the animals they featured. He dismounted carefully, ensuring the dog remained secure in his arms, and approached the entrance. The door chimed as he entered, triggering movement from somewhere in the building's depths. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and animal fear, familiar scents that reminded him of field hospitals and desperate moments when survival hung. By threads thinner than hope, Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the back of the clinic, and Razor's first impression was of someone who had learned to carry more weight than her frame should have been able to bear. She was Asian American, probably in her early 40s, with straight black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that had clearly seen too much suffering. Her medical coat was clean, but showed the kind of wear that came from being washed and rewashed until the fabric surrendered its original texture. She stopped short when she saw Razor, and he watched the familiar progression of emotions cross her face. Surprise at his appearance, wariness at his obvious association with motorcycle culture, and then professional concern as she noticed the injured animal in his arms. Her eyes lingered on his colorless jacket, the visible scars, the general aura of controlled violence that he'd never learned to completely disguise. Can I help you?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to be cautious around strangers, particularly large, heavily scarred strangers who rode motorcycles. "Found her on the highway," Razor said, his own voice rougher than he'd intended after the long ride. "Paws torn up pretty bad, and she's been without water for a while." Dr. Chen's professionalism overcame her wariness as she focused on the injured dog. "Bring her back here," she said, leading him through a narrow hallway lined with cheaply framed certificates and motivational posters that had probably come free with medical supply orders. The examination room was small but scrupulously clean, equipped with basic but well-maintained equipment. Dr. Chen indicated an examination table covered with a fresh paper sheet, and Razor carefully placed the golden retriever on its surface. The dog immediately tried to sit up, tail wagging weakly as she looked between the two humans who represented her only hope for survival. "Easy, girl," Dr. Chen murmured, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had examined thousands of animals. Her touch was gentle but thorough as she assessed the dog's condition, and Razor found himself impressed by the way she communicated reassurance through simple contact. "She's dehydrated and malnourished," Dr. Chen said after several minutes of examination, "but the paw injury is the immediate concern. Looks like she got caught in wire, probably trying to get through a fence. It's infected but not beyond treatment if we act quickly." Razor nodded, unsure why he felt relieved by the diagnosis. "What's it going to cost?" Dr. Chen looked up from the dog, studying Razor's face with the kind of careful assessment that medical professionals perfected early in their careers. "Depends on what we need to do. Cleaning and suturing the wound, antibiotics, IV fluids for the dehydration, probably looking at $200, maybe $300. The number hit Razor like cold water. His cash reserves were already running low, and $300 represented nearly a month of careful living on the road. The smart move would be to thank the veterinarian for her time and find a different solution, perhaps surrendering the dog to animal control or simply walking away from a situation that was rapidly becoming more complicated than he'd signed up for. But the golden retriever chose that moment to rest her head on his hand, dark eyes looking up at him with that same trusting expression that had undone his defenses on the highway. Dr. Chen watched this interaction with obvious surprise, as if she hadn't expected to see gentleness from a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts of other people's nightmares. "She seems to trust you," Dr. Chen observed, her voice carrying a note of curiosity that hadn't been there before. "Don't know why," Razor replied honestly. "Just found her bleeding on the road." Animals are good judges of character, Dr. Chen said, beginning to prepare supplies for treating the wound. They sense things about people that we sometimes miss. As she worked, Razor found himself studying the diplomas on the wall. Dr. Sarah Chen had graduated from UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, a prestigious program that could have led to a lucrative practice in California or any number of better locations. What had brought her to this dying town in the middle of nowhere? The question must have shown on his face, because Dr. Chen glanced up from her work and offered a small smile. "You're wondering what I'm doing here? Your business," Razor said, though he was curious. "My grandmother lived in Millfield," she explained, carefully cleaning the dog's wound while speaking in the soothing tones that veterinarians learn to use with both animals and their humans. "She raised me after my parents died, sent me to school with money she'd saved for 40 years working in a laundry. When she got sick, I came home to take care of her." The story hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither felt the need to voice. Dr. Chen's grandmother had probably died, leaving her with a practice in a town that couldn't really support a veterinarian, but desperately needed one. "The town's been good to me," she continued, though something in her voice suggested the relationship was more complicated than gratitude. "People here take care of each other when they can." Razor watched her work, impressed by the skill and care she showed, despite the basic equipment and cramped conditions. The golden retriever remained remarkably still throughout the procedure, occasionally whimpering but never trying to pull away from treatment that was clearly painful. "What's her story, do you think?" Dr. Chen asked as she began suturing the wound with neat, precise stitches. "Somebody's dog that got loose, probably," Razor said. "She's too well socialized to be a stray. Somebody's missing her." "Will you be looking for her owners?" The question caught him off guard. In his mental calculations, he'd focused on getting the dog treated and then what? He hadn't thought beyond the immediate crisis, hadn't considered what came after the veterinary bills were paid and the wounds were healed. "Don't know," he admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead." Dr. Chen finished the sutures and began wrapping the paw in clean bandages. "She'll need antibiotics for 10 days, and the stitches should come out in 2 weeks. No running or jumping until then, just short walks on a leash." The instructions assumed he would be responsible for the dog's care, a presumption that should have alarmed him, but somehow felt natural. Looking down at the golden retriever, who had dozed off during the treatment with her head still resting against his hand, Razor realized that walking away was no longer an option he was capable of considering. "I'll need to keep her overnight for observation," Dr. Chen continued. "Make sure she responds well to the fluids and antibiotics. You can pick her up tomorrow morning." Razor nodded, reaching for his wallet with his free hand. As he counted out the bills, most of his remaining cash, he felt the familiar weight of a choice that would change the trajectory of his carefully ordered existence. But for the first time in 3 years, the weight didn't feel like a burden. The Millfield Motor Lodge occupied a prime position on the town's main strip, which meant it faced a street where tumbleweeds outnumbered traffic on most days. Razor had chosen it for its cash-friendly policy and the fact that it looked like the kind of place where people minded their own business. The room cost $40 a night, money he couldn't really afford after the veterinary bill, but sleeping outdoors seemed less appealing now that he had responsibilities extending beyond his own survival. Room 12 was a study in functional decay. Thin carpet that had once been blue, panelled walls that belonged to a different decade, and a window air conditioning unit that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. The bed sagged in the middle, and the bathroom fixtures had achieved that particular shade of yellow-white that spoke of years of hard water and harder living. But it was clean, private, and came with no questions about why a man might need to stay close to town longer than originally planned. Razor sat on the edge of the bed, studying the business card Dr. Chen had given him. Desert Animal Care was printed in simple black letters above her name and the clinic's address. On the back, She'd written her cell phone number in case of emergencies. The gesture spoke to a level of trust that surprised him, or perhaps to the desperate optimism of someone who had learned to hope for the best from people, even when experience suggested caution. The evening had stretched longer than he'd expected, filled with conversations he hadn't anticipated having. After settling the dog at the clinic, Dr. Chen had suggested he might want to get dinner at Ruth's diner across the street, while she finished the initial treatment. The suggestion had been casual, but something in her manner indicated it wasn't. Entirely professional, that perhaps she was curious about the scarred stranger who had ridden into town carrying a wounded animal. Ruth's diner existed in the same universe of faded dreams as the rest of Millfield, but it carried itself with more dignity than most. The building was small but well maintained, its windows clean, and its neon sign functional, even if it flickered occasionally with electrical arthritis. Inside, red vinyl booths lined the walls beneath framed photographs that documented the town's better days. Images of bustling streets, crowded celebrations, and people who looked like they believed in their future. Ruth Alvarez herself was a woman in her 60s who moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent decades translating care into comfort food. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes held the kind of warmth that made strangers feel like neighbors. She had seated Razor in a corner booth without comment on his appearance, brought him coffee without being asked, and offered recommendations from a menu that promised more than the kitchen could probably deliver, but did so with evident pride. "You're the one brought the hurt dog to Sarah," she'd said, not really a question. In a town of 847 people, news travelled at the speed of concern. "Word travels fast," Razor had replied, stirring sugar into coffee that was surprisingly good. "Nothing else to talk about most days," Ruth had admitted with a smile that took any sting from the observation. "Sarah said you rode in from the desert. Long way to come for a dog that ain't even yours." The comment had hung in the air between them, carrying implications about character and choices that Razor wasn't sure he was ready to discuss. He'd ordered the meatloaf special partly because he was hungry and partly because he suspected Ruth took pride in her cooking and deserved to have someone appreciate the effort. The meal had been better than expected, comfort food prepared with the kind of attention that came from genuinely caring about the people you fed. Ruth had joined him for coffee when the dinner rush proved to be more of a dinner trickle, sharing stories about the town's history and the people who had shaped it. "Used to be a mining town," she'd explained, refilling his cup from a pot that seemed permanently attached to her hand. "Copper mostly, back when there was demand for it. The mine closed in '89, and most folks moved on to find work elsewhere. Those of us who stayed, well, we stayed for our reasons." Razor had found himself curious about those reasons, though he hadn't pressed. Ruth's diner served as more than a restaurant. It was clearly a gathering place, a source of community in a town that had lost most of its reasons for existing. The photographs on the walls showed her with a man who was obviously her husband, their arms around each other at various community events and celebrations. The absence of recent pictures told a story that didn't need words. "What about you?" Ruth had asked eventually. "What brings a man like you to our little corner of nowhere?" It was a question Razor had been asked many times over the past 3 years, and he'd developed standard answers, passing through, seeing the country, taking some time away from the city. None of them were lies exactly, but they skirted the edges of larger truths about exile and redemption and the weight of carrying too much history. "Just riding," he'd said, which was honest, even if it wasn't complete. Ruth had nodded as if she understood that some stories took time to tell. "Well, you picked a good place for thinking. Desert's got a way of helping a person see things clearly once you get used to the silence." Now, sitting alone in his motel room as darkness settled over Millfield, Razor found himself thinking about that conversation. Ruth's comment about seeing things clearly resonated with something he'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. 3 years of desert wandering had indeed provided clarity, but not the kind he'd expected. Instead of finding peace in solitude, he'd discovered the limits of isolation. The golden retriever's trusting eyes had simply been the catalyst for recognizing what he'd been trying to avoid acknowledging, that running away had its own form of exhaustion. His phone, a basic model chosen for reliability rather than features, showed no messages, which wasn't surprising since virtually no one had the number. The silence that had once been comforting now felt heavy with possibility. Tomorrow he would pick up the dog from Dr. Chen's clinic. And then, what? The question that had been lurking at the edges of his thoughts demanded attention. The practical considerations were daunting. A dog required stability, regular meals, veterinary care, shelter that went beyond nightly motel rooms. It needed routine, companionship, and the kind of predictable life that Razor had spent 3 years avoiding. Yet the alternative, abandoning. An animal that had shown him nothing but trust, felt impossible to contemplate. Outside his window, Millfield settled into its nightly quiet. The streetlights were sparse and provided more atmosphere than illumination, casting long shadows that turned familiar shapes mysterious. A cat prowled between buildings, intent on business that belonged to the night. Somewhere in the distance, a truck shifted gears as it navigated the highway that had brought Razor to this crossroads of choice and consequence. He thought about the photograph in his saddlebag, Amy at her graduation, smiling at a future that probably didn't include room for a father who had chosen violence over family. The picture was 3 years old now, and she would have changed in ways he could only imagine. College, perhaps, or a job that gave her pride and purpose. Maybe someone special who made her laugh the way her mother used to laugh before the brotherhood consumed everything good in their lives. The weight of missed opportunities pressed against his chest, familiar and heavy as old leather. He'd told himself that staying away was protection, that his presence would only complicate lives that were better off without him. But sitting in this desert motel room, he wondered if that reasoning had been more about protecting himself than protecting them. Dr. Chen's kindness earlier had surprised him. She treated both him and the injured dog with professional competence, but there had been something more, a recognition, perhaps, of someone else who understood what it meant to carry responsibilities that weren't originally yours. Her story. About her grandmother, about coming home to care for someone who had sacrificed for her education, resonated with themes of obligation and love that Razor had tried to forget. Ruth's diner had provided another glimpse into lives shaped by choice and circumstance. The photographs on the walls told stories of community, of people who had found meaning in taking care of each other, even when the larger world had moved on without them. There was dignity in that choice, a kind of quiet heroism that didn't require recognition or reward. The golden retriever, he realized he'd begun thinking of her as Chance, though he hadn't consciously chosen the name, represented something he'd thought was beyond his reach. The opportunity to care for another living thing without the complicated dynamics of human relationship. Dogs offered loyalty without judgment, affection without conditions, forgiveness without the need for lengthy explanations about past mistakes. But even that simple relationship carried complications. Where would they go? How would they live? The motorcycle that had been perfect for his solitary wandering was hardly practical for traveling with a recuperating animal. The financial reality was equally challenging. His cash reserves were nearly exhausted, and finding work while maintaining the anonymity he'd cultivated would be difficult. Yet, beneath all the practical concerns lay something more fundamental: the recognition that he was tired of running. 3 years of highway and horizon had taught him that geography wasn't the answer to the questions that haunted him. The desert had provided space for thinking, but thinking without action was just another form of paralysis. The clock on the nightstand showed 10:47 p.m., its red digits glowing in the dim room. In roughly 10 hours, he would return to the clinic to collect Chance, and Dr. Chen would expect some indication of his plans. The uncertainty felt different now, less like the open-ended freedom he'd initially sought. and more like standing. At the edge of something that might require courage he wasn't sure he still possessed. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of dusty highways and trusting eyes, of choices that echoed through years, and the weight of hands that had learned. Both violence and tenderness. In his sleep, Razor rode toward horizons that seemed closer than they had in months, carrying passengers who needed him to be better than he'd ever imagined he could be. Dawn in Millfield arrived with the subtle fanfare of desert sunrise, a gradual lightening of shadows that transformed the town from silhouette to sepia before settling into the harsh clarity of another day, promising temperatures that would test the resolve of both man and machine. Razor had been awake since 5, his internal clock still calibrated to the rhythms of a life lived on constant alert. The motel room's coffee maker produced something that resembled coffee if you didn't examine it too closely, and he sipped it while watching the town come reluctantly to life through his window. By 7:30, he was standing outside the veterinary clinic, helmet tucked under one arm, waiting for Dr. Chen to arrive for what he assumed would be normal business hours. The Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot at 7:45, and she emerged looking like someone who had slept as little as he had. Her hair was pulled back in yesterday's ponytail, and she carried herself with the careful precision of someone operating on caffeine and determination. "You're early," she observed, fumbling for keys while juggling a travel mug and what appeared to be a bag of dog food. "Didn't have anywhere else to be," Razor replied, which was true enough to avoid being a lie. Inside the clinic, the golden retriever, Chance, greeted him with enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Her tail wagged with enough force to shake her entire body, and she whimpered with what sounded like relief when he knelt beside her kennel. The bandaged paw looked professional and clean, and her eyes held more alertness than they had the previous day. "She's been asking for you since about 6 this morning," Dr. Chen said, opening the kennel door. "I think you've made a friend." Chance immediately pressed against Razor's legs, looking up at him with an expression that seemed to say she'd known all along that he would come back. The trust in that gaze hit him harder than it had the day before, carrying with it the weight of expectations and the responsibility that came with being someone's entire world. "How is she?" Razor asked, running his hands over the dog's head and shoulders, checking for signs of pain or distress. "Much better. The antibiotics are working, and she kept down everything I gave her to eat. She'll need to take it easy for another week or so, but she should make a full recovery." Dr. Chen paused, studying his face with the kind of careful attention that medical professionals learn to apply to both their patients and the humans who cared about them. "Have you thought about what comes next?" It was the question he'd been avoiding since waking up, though it had lurked at the edges of every other thought. "Still working on that," he admitted. Dr. Chen nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "There's no rush from my end. Millfield doesn't exactly have an overflow of options for animal placement, and she's clearly bonded with you." The word bonded carried implications that made Razor uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. Bonds meant obligations, expectations, the kind of emotional entanglement he'd spent 3 years avoiding. Yet watching Chance lean against his leg with complete trust, he found it difficult to argue with Dr. Chen's assessment. "I've been thinking," Dr. Chen continued, preparing a bag of medications and written instructions with the efficient movements of someone who had performed this routine countless times. "Miguel Santos, he runs the garage down the street, mentioned yesterday that he could use some help. Nothing permanent, just someone who knows their way around engines. Pays cash, if that matters." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities and complications. Razor had worked on motorcycles for decades, first out of necessity and later as a form of meditation that required both hands and mind to focus on problems that had mechanical solutions. But taking a job meant staying in one place, establishing routines, becoming visible in ways that went against 3 years of carefully cultivated anonymity. "Why?" he asked simply. Dr. Chen finished preparing Chance's discharge materials before answering, and when she looked up, her expression carried a mixture of professional assessment and something more personal. "Because you're good with her," she said, indicating the dog. "Because Miguel needs the help. Because sometimes people end up in places for reasons they don't understand right away." The last observation felt uncomfortably perceptive, as if she'd seen through his careful facade to something he hadn't admitted even to himself. But before he could formulate a response, the clinic's front door chimed, announcing the arrival of someone who moved with the confident stride of someone completely at home in their environment. Miguel Santos was probably in his mid-40s, built like someone who had spent decades wrestling with stubborn machinery and winning more often than not. His dark hair showed streaks of premature silver, and his hands bore the permanent stains and scars that marked him as someone who solved problems with tools rather than words. He wore work clothes that had achieved that perfect balance of cleanliness and functionality that spoke to professional pride. "Sarah, buenos dias," he said, nodding to Dr. Chen before turning his attention to Razor with the kind of frank assessment that one mechanic gave another. "You must be the guy who brought in the golden." "Razor," he said, extending a hand that Miguel shook with the firm grip of someone who understood that first impressions were often lasting ones. "Miguel, Sarah mentioned you might know something." "About engines." "Some," Razor admitted, which was like saying the desert was somewhat dry, but seemed like the appropriate level of modesty for the situation. Miguel's expression shifted slightly, the kind of subtle change that suggested he'd noticed something about Razor's appearance that confirmed his suspicions about the stranger's mechanical capabilities. "Got a shovel head in the shop that's been giving me grief. Owner wants it running like new, but it's got more attitude than a teenager. You want to take a look?" The invitation was casual, but Razor recognized it as a test disguised as a favor. Miguel was offering him a chance to demonstrate his skills without the commitment of formal employment, allowing both men to assess whether they could work together without anyone losing face if it didn't work out. "Sure," Razor said, because the alternative was returning to his motel room to contemplate a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The walk to Miguel's garage took them down Millfield's main street, providing Razor with his first daylight view of the town's commercial district. Most of the storefronts bore for lease signs that had faded to the color of old bones, but a few businesses maintained the kind of determined optimism that suggested their owners had found reasons to stay that transcended simple economics. Santos Automotive occupied a building that had probably housed half a dozen different businesses over the decades, but Miguel had transformed it into something that spoke to both professionalism and personality. The bay doors were open to catch whatever breeze the morning might offer, and the sound of classic rock drifted from speakers that had been positioned to provide background music without overwhelming conversation. The shovelhead in question was a 1978 model that someone had modified extensively, not always wisely. Razor walked around it slowly, letting his eyes catalogue the changes and modifications while his mind began sorting through the possible causes of whatever problems had brought it to Miguel's attention. "Owner says it runs fine for about 20 miles, then starts cutting out," Miguel explained, watching Razor's examination with interest. "I've gone through the usual suspects, fuel system, ignition, even pulled the heads to check for carbon buildup. Everything looks good on paper, but something's not right." Razor knelt beside the motorcycle, running his hands over components, with the kind of familiarity that came from decades of intimate knowledge. The shovelhead engine was temperamental under the best circumstances, requiring an understanding that went beyond simple mechanical knowledge. They had personalities, quirks, that could only be diagnosed through experience and intuition. "Electrical," he said after several minutes of careful inspection. "Something in the charging system. Probably the stator, but it might be the regulator. Won't show up until the engine gets hot and the resistance changes. Miguel nodded slowly, the expression of someone who had suspected the same thing, but needed confirmation from another set of experienced eyes. That's what I was thinking, but the owner's already into me for more than he expected to spend. The comment revealed both Miguel's integrity and his business challenges. In a town where money was scarce, automotive repair became a balance between providing necessary services and not bankrupting customers who had limited options for transportation. "Want me to take a look?" Razor asked, because the puzzle of diagnosis appealed to something in him that had been dormant too long. Miguel's smile was answer enough. Within minutes, Razor found himself with tools in his hands and a problem to solve. Chance lying nearby in whatever shade she could find, watching him work with the patient attention of a dog who had learned that good things happened when her human was focused and content. 2 weeks settled into Millfield's rhythm with surprising ease, each day blending into the next with the comfortable predictability that Razor had convinced himself he no longer wanted. The Shovelhead's electrical gremlins had taken 3 days to fully exercise, leading to other projects that Miguel presented with the casual confidence of someone who had recognized competence and decided to make use of it. The work felt good. The kind of satisfaction that came from solving problems with tangible solutions, from taking something broken and making it whole again. His hands remembered skills that decades of violence had never completely erased, and he found peace in the mechanical certainties of compression ratios, timing curves, and the honest logic of internal combustion engines. Chance had adapted too, their temporary routine with the flexibility that made dogs such reliable companions. She spent her days in the garage, claiming a spot near the tool bench where she could observe the work while staying out of the way. Her paw had healed with remarkable speed, and Dr. Chen had removed the stitches the previous Friday with professional satisfaction and what might have been personal relief. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Chen had announced after the final examination, her hands gentle as she checked the healed wound. "Good as new, maybe better. Dogs are resilient that way." The observation had been directed at Chance, but Razor had sensed it was meant for him as well. Dr. Chen had a way of offering wisdom without preaching, of making observations that carried weight beyond their apparent simplicity. Their conversations, during Chance's follow-up visits, had developed into something that resembled friendship, though neither had explicitly acknowledged the shift from professional courtesy to genuine connection. Ruth's diner had become his regular stop for breakfast and dinner, partly for convenience, and partly because Ruth herself provided the kind of steady maternal presence that he'd forgotten he missed. She asked no questions about his past, but showed obvious pleasure in his growing attachment to both the dog and the town. Her recommendations always came with gentle authority. Try the apple pie, sit in the booth by the window where Chance could watch the street. Don't worry about the check because everyone deserved a good meal when they were getting back on their feet. The getting back on their feet comment had surprised him, both for its accuracy and for Ruth's ability to see through his carefully maintained emotional distance. But then, people who survived in places like Millfield probably developed sharp instincts about recognizing others who were rebuilding their lives from whatever pieces remained after disaster. Miguel had proved to be an ideal employer in the informal way that such relationships developed in small towns. He paid cash at the end of each day, asked no questions about Razor's background beyond his mechanical qualifications, and showed appreciation for work well done through actions rather than words. The garage had begun attracting customers from surrounding towns, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations about the new mechanic who could diagnose problems that had stumped others. "You're developing a reputation," Miguel had mentioned the previous evening as they closed up shop. "Mrs. Henderson from Benson drove 40 miles just to have you look at her husband's Buick. Said her nephew in Phoenix told her there was someone in Millfield who actually understood carburetors." The comment had carried pride, as if Miguel took personal satisfaction in his garage's growing reputation. But it also highlighted something that made Razor increasingly uncomfortable: visibility. Success meant recognition, and recognition meant the possibility that his carefully constructed anonymity might begin to unravel. That concern had driven him to the town's small library during lunch breaks, using their single computer terminal to search for any mention of his name or recent Hells Angels activity in Arizona. The searches had yielded little of concern, mostly old news articles about arrests and court cases that belonged to his previous life. The Brotherhood had apparently moved on without him, focusing their attention on territories and conflicts that no longer involved Vince "Razor" Delaney. The relief he felt at this discovery was complicated by an unexpected sense of loss. For 40 years, his identity had been inextricably linked to the Angels. His sense of purpose derived from brotherhood and shared purpose, even when that purpose led to violence and ultimately exile. Discovering that the world had continued without him forced a recognition that his importance to the organization had been less significant than his ego had required him to believe. But if the past was releasing its hold on him, the present was making increasingly complex demands. His cash situation had stabilized thanks to Miguel's steady work, but the motel room was becoming an expensive and impractical long-term solution. Chance needed more space, more routine, and the kind of stability that came with having a real home rather than a series of temporary accommodations. The problem was that establishing a permanent address meant commitments that extended beyond the day-to-day mechanics of survival. It meant believing in a future that included Millfield, accepting that his wandering phase might be ending, and trusting that a town of 847 people could provide whatever he was looking for in the next chapter of his life. The internal debate had been complicated by external pressures that were beginning to manifest in subtle but unmistakable ways. During his morning coffee at Ruth's Diner, he'd overheard conversations between longtime residents that suggested all was not well in Millfield's carefully maintained equilibrium. Third notice from the bank, he'd heard Mrs. Peterson whisper to her companion the previous Tuesday. They're saying if we don't bring the mortgage current by month's end, they'll start foreclosure proceedings. Similar conversations had reached his ears throughout the week. Fragments of worry about property taxes, utility bills, and the gradual economic strangulation that was squeezing long-time residents out of homes they'd owned for decades. The pattern suggested something more systematic than simple individual financial struggles. Miguel had confirmed his suspicions during a rare moment of candid conversation while they worked on a transmission that required 4 hands and careful coordination. Started about 6 months ago, Miguel had explained, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who understood mechanical problems better than financial ones. Letters from lawyers representing some development company out of Phoenix, offering to buy properties for cash but way below market value. People who can't afford to refuse are starting to take the deals. The story was familiar from dozens of small towns across the West. Outside interests recognizing the potential value of land that current residents couldn't afford to hold on to. What made Millfield's situation different was the systematic nature of the pressure, as if someone had identified the town as particularly vulnerable and was conducting a coordinated campaign to accelerate its decline. What kind of development? Razor had asked, though he suspected the answer would be depressingly predictable. Solar farm, supposedly. Company called Desert Sun Holdings. Representatives came through last month talking about bringing jobs and investment to the area. Funny thing is, nobody I know has ever heard of them before, and their business address turns out to be a post office box in Scottsdale. The information had triggered warning bells that Razor recognized from his years with the Angels. Shell companies, Coordinated pressure campaigns and systematic targeting of vulnerable communities were tactics he'd seen employed by organizations that preferred to operate in legal gray areas. The question was whether Desert Sun Holdings was simply an aggressive but legitimate development company, or something more sinister. That question had been answered, at least partially, the previous afternoon when two men in expensive suits had visited the garage while Miguel was at lunch. They'd introduced themselves as representatives of Desert Sun Holdings, offering to purchase Miguel's property for what they claimed was a generous price, but which was obviously well below its actual value. "Friendly conversation," the older man had explained, his smile carrying the kind of practiced warmth that professional persuaders learn to deploy. "Just wanted to let you know about opportunities that might be coming available. Town like this, sometimes change is inevitable. Smart business owners get ahead of the curve." Razor had listened from beneath the hood of a pickup truck, his presence unacknowledged by the visitors, but his attention focused entirely on their conversation with Miguel. The tone had been polite, professional, and subtly threatening in ways that were probably deniable but unmistakably clear to anyone who understood how such pressure campaigns typically developed. Miguel had declined their offer with equal politeness, but after they left, his demeanor had carried the weight of someone who recognized that the conversation had been more warning than negotiation. "Third time they've been by," he'd told Razor, getting more insistent each visit. Now, as Razor sat on the motel room's single chair, watching Chance sleep on a blanket they'd bought at the town's general store, he found himself contemplating challenges that extended far beyond his personal situation. Millfield was under siege, its residents facing pressures that threatened to dissolve the community that had provided him with something approaching peace. The old Razor would have loaded his saddlebags and found a different highway, leaving others to fight battles that weren't his responsibility. But the man who had spent 2 weeks learning to care about a wounded dog, who had found satisfaction in honest work and genuine community, discovered that walking away was no longer a viable option. Millfield had given him a chance to rebuild. His life and the people who had welcomed him despite his appearance and obvious history deserved better than abandonment when they faced their own crisis. The recognition that he was prepared to fight for something again came with both relief and trepidation. But for the first time in 3 years, Vince "Razor" Delaney felt like he had found something worth defending. The sound of motorcycle engines approaching from the south reached Razor before he could see the riders, the distinctive rumble of Harley Davidson, V-twins echoing off the canyon walls that bracketed Millfield's entrance. He was replacing the brake pads on Miguel's personal truck when the noise registered. But something in the rhythm, the synchronized cadence of multiple bikes traveling in formation, made him straighten and reach for the shop rag that would clean the grease from his hands. Miguel noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Everything okay?" "Maybe," Razor said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He moved to the garage's open bay door, Chance following with the alertness that dogs developed when their humans showed signs of tension. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and Razor found himself counting engines by their individual notes. 4 bikes, maybe 5, traveling at exactly the speed limit with the disciplined precision that marked experienced riders on official business. When the motorcycles finally came into view, Razor felt his stomach drop with the sick recognition of a past that had finally caught up with his present. The lead bike was a custom-built Softail with enough chrome to blind unwary drivers, ridden by a man whose presence commanded attention even at a distance. The others followed in precise formation, their riders wearing the kind of leather that spoke to both wealth and affiliation. But it was the patches on the lead rider's jacket that confirmed Razor's worst fears. Even at 50 yards, the Hells Angels colors were unmistakable, and the man wearing them was someone Razor had hoped never to see again. Marcus "Snake" Torino had aged well in the 3 years since their last encounter, his dark hair now showing distinguished streaks of silver, and his face carrying the kind of weathered authority that came with surviving decades in an organization where leadership was earned through violence and maintained through fear. The snake tattoo that had given him his road name still coiled up his left arm, but it was now accompanied by other ink that marked his rise in the Brotherhood's hierarchy. The motorcycles pulled into the garage's parking area with theatrical precision, engines shutting down in synchronized silence that felt more ominous than any sound. Snake removed his helmet with deliberate slowness, his dark eyes scanning the garage until they found Razor standing in the doorway. The smile that spread across his face carried no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Vince fucking Delaney," Snake said, swinging his leg over the bike with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with being the center of attention. "Or should I call you Razor, for old time's sake?" The other riders dismounted with equal precision, 4 men whose presence turned Miguel's simple garage into something that felt like a stage set for violence. Razor recognized 2 of them from the old days, Tommy Chains Rodriguez and Danny Ink Sullivan, both of whom had been prospects when Razor was still a respected member of the Brotherhood. The other 2 were strangers, younger men whose colors indicated they'd earned their place in the organization after Razor's exile. "Snake," Razor replied, his voice carrying none of the warmth that might once have been expected between former brothers. "Long way from Phoenix. Business brings us to all kinds of interesting places these days," Snake said, his gaze taking in the garage, Miguel's obvious nervousness, and Chance, who had positioned herself protectively between Razor and the newcomers, despite being outnumbered and outweighed. "Speaking of business, heard you'd found yourself a new line of work. Mechanic suits you, honest labor and all that." The words carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on anyone present. In the Brotherhood's value system, honest labor was something for civilians, for people who lacked the strength or intelligence to take what they wanted through more direct means. Snake's comment was both an insult and a reminder that Razor had fallen far from his former status. Miguel cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tension-filled silence. "Gentlemen, if you need work done on your bikes, I'd be happy." "We're not here about motorcycles," Snake interrupted, his attention never leaving Razor's face. "We're here about family business, the kind that doesn't concern civilians." The dismissal was polite but absolute, and Miguel took the hint with the wisdom of someone who had learned to recognize when his presence was neither wanted nor safe. "I'll be at the diner," he said to Razor, the offer of backup implicit but unspoken. "Come find me when you're finished." After Miguel's departure, Snake's facade of politeness dropped away like a discarded mask. 3 years, Razor. 3 years since you walked away from everything we built together, everything my old man died to protect. The reference to Big Jim. Torino's death was calculated to provoke, and it succeeded. Jim had been more than Snake's father. He'd been a mentor to young Vince Delaney, teaching him the code that had governed 40 years of his life. The idea that Razor's departure had somehow dishonored that legacy cut deeper than any physical wound. "Your old man wouldn't recognize what the club's become," Razor said, "because some truths demanded to be spoken regardless of consequences. He believed in brotherhood, not whatever this is." Snake's expression darkened, and the men behind him shifted in ways that suggested violence was never more than a heartbeat away. "Careful, old man. You lost the right to lecture about brotherhood when you chose to protect some junky piece of shit over your own brothers." The memory of that night in Tucson hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Razor had made his choice based on principle, but Snake had interpreted it as betrayal. The difference in their perspectives had made reconciliation impossible and exile inevitable. "So what now?" Razor asked, because prolonging the conversation would only increase the danger to innocent people. "You came a long way just to reminisce about old times." Snake's smile returned, but it was the expression of a shark that had detected blood in the water. Now we discuss the future, specifically your future, and how it intersects with our current business interests. He gestured toward the town with theatrical expansiveness. Beautiful little community you found here, Razor. Quiet, peaceful, full of good people just trying to live their lives. Would be a shame if something happened to disrupt all that tranquility. The threat was unmistakable, and Razor felt the familiar cold rage that had once made him feared throughout the Southwest. But now the anger was tempered by something new. Protectiveness. That extended beyond his own survival to encompass people who had shown him kindness when he deserved none. Desert Sun Holdings, Razor said, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place with horrifying clarity. That's you. Very good, Snake replied with mock approval. Always were smart, even when you were being stupid. Yeah, Desert Sun is one of our ventures. Amazing what you can accomplish with legitimate business practices and properly filed paperwork. The revelation reframed everything Razor had learned about Millfield's struggles. The coordinated pressure campaign, the below-market offers, the systematic targeting of vulnerable residents, all of it orchestrated by his former brotherhood as part of some larger scheme that required control of the town's property. Solar farm? Razor asked, though he suspected the answer would be more complex than renewable energy. Among other things, Snake confirmed. Turns out this little stretch of desert has some interesting geological features, the kind that make certain types of businesses very profitable if you have the right permits and the proper political connections. The implication was clear. Whatever Snake and his associates had planned for Millfield, it required the town's residents to be gone. The solar farm story was just cover for something that needed isolation, secrecy, and the kind of infrastructure that legitimate businesses couldn't provide. So you came here to what? Recruit me? Razor asked. Offer me a chance to get back. In the Brotherhood by helping you steal an entire town. Snake's laugh was genuinely amused. Recruit you? Razor, you're 68 years old and haven't thrown a punch in anger for 3 years. You're not exactly recruitment material anymore. The dismissal stung, but it also carried an implicit message about how Snake viewed the threat Razor might represent. Then what do you want? I want you gone, Snake said simply. Pack up your dog, your tools, and whatever dignity you've managed to salvage, and ride out of here before sunset. Find another town, another garage, another life that doesn't interfere with business that's bigger than you can handle. The ultimatum hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, distorting everything around it. Razor looked at Chance, who was watching the confrontation with the alertness of an animal that understood tension, even if she couldn't comprehend the human complexities that created it. He thought about Miguel's kindness, Dr. Chen's growing a trust, Ruth's maternal warmth, and the community that had given him something approaching peace. And if I don't leave? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Snake's expression hardened into something that Razor remembered from their violent youth, when conflicts were settled with finality rather than negotiation. Then we'll have to discuss your relationship with this community in terms that everyone can understand, starting with that pretty little veterinarian who seems to have taken such an interest in your welfare. The threat against Dr. Chen crossed a line that Razor hadn't even realized existed until that moment. The cold rage he'd been suppressing since Snake's arrival crystallized into something harder and more focused than anger, a clarity of purpose that he hadn't felt since leaving the Brotherhood. You've got until sunset, Snake continued, either oblivious to the change in Razor's demeanor or confident enough in his position to ignore it. After that, we start making this town understand that fighting progress can be hazardous to your health. The Hell's Angels mounted their motorcycles with the same synchronized precision they displayed upon arrival, engines roaring to life in a symphony of controlled power. Snake was the last to start his bike, his eyes locked on Razor's face as if memorizing it for future reference. "Sunset, Razor!" he called over the engine noise. "Don't make me come looking for you!" The motorcycles pulled away in formation, leaving. Behind, only the smell of exhaust and the echo of engines growing distant. Razor stood in the garage doorway long after they disappeared, Chance pressing against his leg with the intuitive understanding that their world had just changed in ways that would require all their courage to navigate. For the first time in 3 years, Vince Razor Delaney was no longer running from his past. His past had found him, and now he would have to decide whether the man he'd become was strong enough to protect the life he'd built and the people who had given it meaning. The news of Snake's visit spread through Millfield with the efficiency that only genuine fear could provide. By the time Razor reached Ruth's diner, word had already traveled through whatever network of concerned neighbors and careful observers that small towns developed to protect themselves from external threats. Ruth took one look at his face and poured coffee without being asked, her movements carrying the tense precision of someone preparing for a storm. "Miguel told us," she said quietly, glancing toward the booth where Miguel sat with Dr. Chen and 3 other residents Razor recognized but hadn't formally met. "Said they knew you from before." "Yeah," Razor replied, because admitting the connection seemed pointless now that his carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered. "Hell's Angels. I used to be one of them." Ruth nodded as if she'd suspected as much, her expression carrying neither judgment nor surprise. "Used to be," she repeated, emphasizing the past tense. "What matters is what you are now." The conversation at the corner booth quieted as Razor approached, 5 pairs of eyes turning to assess a man who had suddenly become either their salvation or their doom. Dr. Chen's face showed confusion mixed with concern, while Miguel's expression carried the wariness of someone who had recognized that his casual friendship with the new mechanic had unexpectedly complicated his life. "Razor," Dr. Chen said, her voice carefully neutral, "Miguel was just telling us about your visitors." He slid into the booth beside her, Chance settling at his feet with the patient alertness she'd maintained since the confrontation at the garage. "They want me gone by sunset. If I stay, they'll start making life difficult for everyone who's been kind to me." "And if you go?" asked Tom Bradley, the elderly man who ran the town's struggling general store. "They'll take the town anyway," Razor said, "because sugarcoating the situation would serve no one. This isn't about me, it's about whatever they're really planning for this land. I'm just an inconvenience they want to eliminate before they get serious about clearing everyone else out." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of recognition. Everyone at the table had lived through enough small-town politics to understand that outside interests rarely arrived with good intentions, and the presence of the Hell's Angels elevated the threat far beyond simple economic pressure. "What are they really after?" Miguel asked. "You know them. What would make this place worth their attention?" Razor considered the question, drawing on decades of experience with the Brotherhood's business practices. "Could be drug distribution, isolated location, good highway access, close enough to the border to be useful. Could be money laundering through the solar farm development. Could be something worse." "Worse how?" Dr. Chen asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The Angels don't usually get involved in legitimate business unless there's something illegitimate hiding underneath. Whatever they're planning, it needs isolation, secrecy, and a place where law enforcement doesn't pay much attention." Tom Bradley's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, as if seeking warmth despite the desert heat outside. "So, we're caught between selling our homes for pennies or having them taken by force." "Maybe not," Razor said, the words surprising him as much as they did the others. He'd come to the diner expecting to say goodbye, to apologize for bringing danger to people who'd shown him nothing but kindness. Instead, he found himself considering possibilities that 3 years ago would have been unthinkable. "What do you mean?" Ruth asked, sliding into the booth across from him with the determined expression of someone who had decided to face whatever came next with her community intact. I mean, maybe it's time someone stood up to them. The suggestion hung in the air, like a challenge thrown down in the middle of a barroom, audacious and potentially suicidal. Miguel was the first to respond, his voice carrying disbelief mixed with something that might have been hope. "You're talking about fighting the Hells Angels? 5 of us against however many they can bring?" "Not fighting," Razor corrected, though the distinction felt semantic even to him. "Outsmarting, making it more trouble than it's worth for them. To stay, convincing them that easier targets exist somewhere else." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her medical training apparently extending to diagnosing cases of potentially terminal optimism. "How exactly would we do that? They have numbers, weapons, and no legal constraints on their behavior. We have what? Good intentions and a golden retriever." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Razor found himself almost smiling at her assessment. "We have something they don't expect. Home field advantage and people who have more to lose than they do." Over the next 2 hours, what had started as a desperate conversation evolved into something resembling a plan. Not a good plan necessarily, but one that offered alternatives to either immediate surrender or inevitable defeat. Razor found himself drawing on knowledge he'd accumulated during 40 years in the Brotherhood, understanding their tactics, recognizing their weaknesses, anticipating their likely responses to resistance. "They'll start with intimidation," he explained, sketching rough diagrams on napkins that illustrated Millfield's geography and potential defensive positions. "Vandalism, maybe some minor violence to establish that they're serious. They want people scared enough to accept whatever deal gets offered next." "So we don't get scared," Ruth said with the matter-of-fact determination that had probably helped her survive decades of running a business in an economically challenged town. "Easier said than done," Tom Bradley observed. "Most folks around here aren't exactly prepared for urban warfare. Don't need to be warriors," Razor replied. "Just need to be inconvenient enough that Snake decides this particular piece of real estate isn't worth the aggravation." The plan that emerged was part community organizing, part guerrilla tactics, and part desperate improvisation. They would document everything, every visit from Desert Sun Holdings representatives, every act of intimidation, every attempt to pressure residents into selling. Dr. Chen would use her connections with veterinary colleagues to establish communication networks that couldn't be easily monitored. Miguel would coordinate with other business owners to ensure that no one faced the pressure alone. But beneath the organizational details lay a more fundamental strategy. They would make Snake's life complicated in ways that legitimate business couldn't tolerate. Bad publicity, regulatory scrutiny, and the kind of official attention that criminal enterprises typically avoided would all be deployed to convince the Angels that easier targets existed elsewhere. "You realize this could get people hurt," Dr. Chen said as the meeting began to wind down, her medical ethics apparently requiring her to voice the obvious dangers. "People are going to get hurt anyway," Razor replied, "because pretending otherwise would be both dishonest and dangerous. At least this way, we have some control over how it happens." As the group began to disperse, making plans to contact other residents and begin implementing their hastily conceived resistance, Dr. Chen lingered behind. When they were alone, except for Ruth, who was pointedly cleaning tables that didn't need attention, she fixed Razor with the kind of direct gaze that medical professionals learn to use when delivering difficult diagnoses. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why? What? Why stay? Why fight for a town you've been part of for exactly 2 weeks? You could disappear tonight, find another place, start over again somewhere else." It was a fair question, one that Razor had been asking himself since Snake's ultimatum. The practical answer was that running would only delay the inevitable. The Angels would find him eventually, and next time they might not bother with warnings. But the deeper truth was more complicated and harder to articulate. "Because I'm tired of running," he said finally. "Because for the first time in 3 years, I found people who looked at me and saw something other than my worst mistakes. Because that dog over there trusts me to take care of her, and she deserves better than a master who abandons everything he cares about when things get difficult." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, as if his answer had confirmed something she'd already suspected. "And because you think you owe the town something for accepting you." "Maybe," Razor admitted. "Or maybe I'm just too old and tired to keep pretending that running away solves anything." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold that reminded Razor of better sunsets shared with people who had mattered to him before violence and poor choices had destroyed those relationships. In a few hours, Snake's deadline would arrive, and with it the moment when Razor would have to choose between the safety of continued exile and the dangerous uncertainty of making a stand. But as he walked back to the garage with Chance at his side, passing buildings and people who had begun to feel like home, Razor realized that the choice had already been made. Somewhere between finding an injured dog on a desert highway and discovering that kindness still existed in a world he'd thought had forgotten how to be gentle, he had stopped running from his past and started building toward a future that might actually be worth defending. The old church bell at the center of town began to ring the evening hour, its bronze voice carrying across the desert air with the authority of something that had called this community together for generations. Tonight, it would call them together again, but this time to face a threat that would test whether the bonds of neighborliness were strong enough to stand against the organized malice of men who had forgotten that some things were worth more than profit. Razor paused at the sound, one scarred hand resting on Chance's head as she looked up at him with the absolute trust that had started this entire transformation. Tomorrow would bring Snake's return and the beginning of whatever came next, but tonight he would spend preparing for the first fight in 3 years that he actually wanted to win. The bell's final note faded into the desert silence, and Vince, Razor. Delaney began the walk toward whatever redemption might look like for a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Dawn came to Millfield with the artificial stillness that precedes storms, the desert air holding its breath, while shadows shortened and the temperature began its daily climb toward unbearable. Razor had spent the night in the garage rather than the motel, working by lamplight to prepare both his motorcycle and his resolve for whatever the day might bring. Chance had stayed close, her presence a constant reminder of what he stood to lose if his desperate gamble failed. The first sign that Snake intended to keep his word came with the sound of breaking glass from the direction of the town center. Razor looked up from the tool he'd been sharpening to see smoke rising from what appeared to be Tom Bradley's general store. The message was clear and brutally effective. The intimidation phase of Snake's campaign had begun. By the time Razor reached the store, half the town had gathered to watch Tom sweep up the remains of his front window while trying to maintain the dignity of a man who refused to be cowed by bullies. The rock that had done the damage lay among the glass shards, wrapped in a note that Tom handed to Razor without comment. "Last chance," the message read in Snake's distinctive handwriting. "Sunset tonight, or everyone pays." Dr. Chen appeared at Razor's elbow, her face pale but determined. "Mrs. Henderson found her tires slashed this morning." Miguel's garage door was spray-painted with some very creative profanity. "They're making their point. The point being that resistance has consequences," Razor said, crumpling the note in his fist. Around them, Millfield's residents watched with the careful attention of people trying to decide whether their courage was stronger than their common sense. Ruth pushed through the small crowd, her silver hair catching the morning sunlight and her expression carrying the kind of maternal fury that had probably intimidated generations of misbehaving customers. "Tom Bradley, you get that glass cleaned up and send the bill to whatever insurance company still acknowledges this town exists. The rest of you, we've got a community meeting in 1 hour at the church." The authority in her voice brooked no argument, and people began to disperse with the purposeful movement of individuals who had decided that submission was not an acceptable option. Razor found himself impressed by the quiet resolve that seemed to be spreading through the community like a contagious form of courage. The church that housed their emergency meeting was a simple structure that had probably served multiple denominations. Over the decades, its wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers seeking comfort in faith and fellowship. Today, it housed a different kind of congregation, united not by shared beliefs, but by shared determination to resist forces that threatened their way of life. Razor took a seat near the back, Chance settling beside him with the alert patience she'd developed during their weeks in Millfield. Around them, conversations buzzed with the nervous energy of people who had made dangerous decisions and were now committed to seeing them through regardless of consequences. Ruth stood at the simple pulpit, her presence commanding attention with the natural authority that some people carried without effort. "We all know why we're here," she began, her voice carrying easily through the small space. "Oh, we've got people trying to drive us out of our homes, and they're not planning to use legal methods to accomplish it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation, punctuated by angry comments about property damage and verbal threats that had been delivered during the early morning hours. Snake's men had been busy, ensuring that every resident understood the stakes of continued resistance. "Now, we can give in to their pressure and sell our homes for whatever they're offering," Ruth continued. "Or we can stand together and show them that Millfield isn't going to be intimidated by a bunch of bullies on motorcycles." Tom Bradley stood up from his seat in the front row, his weathered hands shaking slightly with either age or adrenaline. "Easy words, Ruth, but what happens when they decide to escalate beyond broken windows? Some of us have grandchildren who visit. Some of us can't afford to replace what they might destroy." The observation hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront the reality that their resistance could invite retaliation that went far beyond property damage. Razor felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These people were risking everything partly because he had given them hope that resistance was possible. "Tom's right to be scared," Razor said, standing slowly and feeling every eye in the room turn toward him. "These aren't people who make empty threats. They will escalate, and people will get hurt before this is over." The honesty of his assessment seemed to deflate some of the room's fighting spirit, but Razor wasn't finished. "But they're also not invincible. They're used to people backing down when threatened, used to problems that can be solved with intimidation and violence. They're not used to communities that fight back smart instead of fighting back hard." Dr. Chen spoke up from her seat near the middle of the church. "What does fighting back smart look like against people who don't follow any rules? It looks like making their lives complicated in ways they can't solve by breaking things," Razor replied. "It looks like turning their own tactics against them, making them visible when they want to stay invisible, making them accountable when they're used to operating without consequences." Miguel raised his hand like a student seeking permission to speak. "How do we do that without getting ourselves killed in the process?" Razor smiled grimly, pulling a small device from his pocket that he'd retrieved from his saddlebags during the night. "We document everything, every threat, every act of vandalism, every attempt at intimidation. We make sure that when they escalate, the whole world is watching." The device was a small digital camera, basic but functional, one of the few pieces of modern technology that Razor had carried during his years of wandering. Around it, he began to outline a strategy that combined old-fashioned community organizing with the kind of asymmetric warfare tactics that had been developed to fight. Superior forces using intelligence rather than strength. "They want us scared and isolated," he said, his voice gaining strength as the plan crystallized in his mind. "So we stay connected, stay visible, and make sure that everything they do becomes part of a public record that they can't control or suppress." The church bell began to ring noon, its bronze voice carrying across the desert with the same authority it had held for generations of Millfield residents seeking guidance in times of crisis. Today, it seemed to be calling them not to surrender, but to remember that some things were worth defending, regardless of the cost. As the meeting broke up and people began to organize themselves into the working groups that would implement their desperate strategy, Razor felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the satisfaction of being part of something larger than his own survival. Whether their plan would succeed remained to be seen, but for the first time since leaving the Hells Angels, he was fighting for people who deserved his loyalty rather than running from consequences he'd earned through his own choices. Outside, the desert sun had reached that intensity that made the air shimmer with heat waves, and somewhere in that vastness, Snake and his men were preparing for the next phase of their campaign to claim Millfield for whatever dark purposes they had in mind. But inside the church, a community had decided that some things were worth defending, and they had chosen an unlikely champion to help them make their stand. The confrontation came as the sun reached its apex, turning Millfield's main street into a furnace of reflected heat and shimmering possibility. Snake and his enlarged crew, now 8 men instead of 5, rode into town with the casual arrogance of predators who had never encountered prey that fought back effectively. Their motorcycles lined up in front of Ruth's diner with military precision, engines shutting down in synchronized silence that felt more like a threat than the roar of their arrival. Razor watched from the garage where he'd positioned himself, with clear sightlines to the street and rapid access to the communications equipment they'd hastily assembled. Around town, residents had taken up their assigned positions with cameras, cell phones, and the kind of grim determination that came from having nothing left to lose except their dignity. Snake dismounted his custom Softail with theatrical slowness, his movements calculated to project confidence and intimidation in equal measure. But something in his posture suggested that the morning's reconnaissance had revealed more organized resistance than he'd expected. The broken windows and slashed tires had been documented, photographed, and reported to law enforcement agencies that might actually care about crimes committed against small communities. "Time's up, Razor," Snake called across the empty street, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Last chance to ride away from this before it gets ugly for everyone." Instead of responding immediately, Razor activated the recording equipment that Dr. Chen had borrowed from the clinic's diagnostic machines. Every word, every threat, every act of intimidation would be preserved and transmitted to contacts outside Millfield who could ensure the information reached people with authority to act. "Actually, Snake," Razor said, stepping into the street, with Chance at his side, "I think it's time for you to explain to everyone what Desert Sun Holdings really has planned for this land." The question seemed to catch Snake off guard, his confident expression flickering with uncertainty. Behind him, his men shifted restlessly, their body language suggesting they'd been expecting a different kind of confrontation, one that involved more violence and less public scrutiny. "Don't know what you're talking about, old man," Snake replied, but his voice carried less conviction than it had moments earlier. Ruth emerged from her diner with the fearless authority that came from 6 decades of dealing with difficult customers, her phone held prominently in her hand and obviously recording. "Funny thing about that," she said conversationally, "because we've been doing some research on your company. Turns out Desert Sun Holdings has some very interesting business associates." Miguel appeared from the direction of his garage, similarly armed with recording equipment and flanked by Tom Bradley and 3 other business owners who had decided that documentation was more powerful than confrontation. "Associates with criminal records," Miguel added. "Associates who've been involved in money laundering operations disguised as legitimate development projects." The information hit Snake like a physical blow, his face darkening with the realization that his carefully constructed cover story was unraveling in real time. The Brotherhood's business model depended on operating below the radar of law enforcement attention, using legitimate businesses to hide illegal activities. Public scrutiny was the one weapon they couldn't counter with violence. "You're making a big mistake," Snake said, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket with practiced subtlety. "The mistake," said a new voice from the direction of the town's entrance, "would be reaching for that weapon while federal agents are watching." The speaker was a woman in her 40s wearing the kind of nondescript business attire that marked her as law enforcement, even before she displayed the badge that identified her as Agent Sarah Morales, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Behind her, 3 other agents emerged from positions they'd taken around the town's perimeter, their presence suggesting that Millfield's resistance had attracted attention from people with the authority to make Snake's life very complicated. "Gentlemen," Agent Morales continued, approaching the group of bikers with the calm confidence of someone backed by federal authority, "we've been investigating Desert Sun Holdings for several months now, tracking financial irregularities that suggest money laundering and racketeering activities. Your visit here today provides some very interesting context for that investigation." Snake's expression shifted from anger to calculation, his criminal instincts recognizing that the situation had moved beyond simple intimidation into territory where violence would only make things worse. Around him, his men waited for orders. That wouldn't come because even Snake wasn't reckless enough to assault federal agents in front of multiple witnesses with recording equipment. "We're just businessmen conducting legitimate development research," Snake said, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate law enforcement attention. "Businessmen who travel in groups, carry concealed weapons, and threaten local residents who decline to sell their property," Agent Morales asked. "Businessmen whose company's financial records show cash flows that don't match any legitimate business activity we can identify?" The game was over, though Snake was too experienced to surrender without attempting to salvage something from the situation. His eyes found Razor across the street, carrying a mixture of hatred and grudging respect for an opponent who had outmaneuvered him using intelligence rather than violence. "This isn't finished," Snake said quietly, the words intended for Razor alone, but audible to everyone present. "Yeah, it is," Razor replied, his voice carrying the finality that came from recognizing that some chapters of life needed to be closed. "Permanently. You chose your path, and I chose mine. Don't come back to Millfield." The Hells Angels mounted their motorcycles with considerably less ceremony than they displayed upon arrival, their departure marked by frustrated engine noise, and the kind of subdued anger that came from recognizing defeat. Snake was the last to leave, his final glance toward Razor carrying promises that would probably never be kept. As the sound of their engines faded into the desert distance, Millfield's residents began to emerge from their positions with the cautious relief of people who had survived something they hadn't been sure they could handle. Agent Morales remained behind to take statements and begin the process of building a federal case against Desert Sun Holdings, but the immediate threat had been neutralized through community action and careful planning rather than violence. Razor found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand, pat his back, and express gratitude for leadership he hadn't realized he'd been providing. But his attention was focused on Chance, who had remained calm throughout the confrontation with the intuitive understanding that her human was finally where he belonged. For the first time in 3 years, Vince Razor Delaney felt like he had won a fight that mattered. 6 months later, Millfield wore the subtle signs of a community that had rediscovered its reasons for existing. The broken windows had been replaced, the vandalized buildings repainted, and the general air of defeat that had hung over the town like desert dust had given way to something that might cautiously be called optimism. The population sign still read 847, but that number felt more stable now, less like a countdown towards zero and more like the foundation for whatever came next. Razor adjusted the new collar around Chance's neck, the leather soft and supple with Chance Delaney engraved on a brass nameplate that caught the morning sunlight. The formality of giving her his surname had felt important somehow, a public acknowledgement that they belonged to each other in ways that transcended the simple relationship between man and rescued animal. "She's looking good," Dr. Chen observed, running her hands over Chance's coat with the professional thoroughness that had become familiar and comforting over the months of their deepening friendship. The veterinary clinic had expanded into the building next door, partly to accommodate the increase in business from surrounding communities, and partly because Dr. Chen had decided that Millfield's future was worth investing in. Their relationship had evolved with the careful patience that came from recognizing that both had been wounded by previous experiences and needed time to trust that good things could actually last. Romance had grown from friendship, commitment from shared challenges, and love from the gradual recognition that they made each other better than they had been alone. "Miguel's got that shovel head running like a dream," Razor said, indicating the motorcycle that was currently the centerpiece of Santos Automotive's display window. The garage had become something of a destination for classic bike enthusiasts, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations about the mechanic who could coax life from engines that other shops had pronounced terminal. The partnership between Razor and Miguel had formalized into shared ownership of the garage, with Miguel handling the business side and Razor focusing on the increasingly complex restoration projects that arrived from across the Southwest. They worked well together, their different skills complementing each other in ways that made both men more successful than they had been individually. "Business is good?" Dr. Chen asked, though she already knew the answer from the steady stream of customers and the expansion that had added 2 more service bays to the original building. "Better than good," Razor replied. "Miguel's talking about hiring another mechanic, maybe someone who can handle the newer electronic systems. I'm better with the old stuff anyway." The admission carried no regret, only the satisfaction that came from recognizing his place in the world and being content with what he found there. At 68, he had no desire to master computerized diagnostics or hybrid power systems. His expertise lay with mechanical systems that could be understood through touch and sound, problems that could be solved with patience and accumulated wisdom rather than digital technology. Ruth's Diner had become their regular meeting place for Sunday breakfast, a tradition that had developed organically as their small group of friends found comfort in routine and shared meals. Today's gathering included Miguel and his wife Carmen, who had returned from Phoenix after deciding that Millfield's future was more promising than they'd originally thought. "Federal trial starts next month," Ruth announced, refilling coffee. Cups with the practiced efficiency that had made her establishment the town's unofficial community center. "Agent Morales says they've got enough evidence to put Snake and his associates away for a very long time." The news was welcome, but not unexpected. The FBI's investigation into Desert Sun Holdings had uncovered a network of financial crimes that extended far beyond Millfield, with money laundering operations spanning multiple states and involving several other criminal organizations. Snake's attempt to intimidate a small desert town had inadvertently exposed activities that federal authorities had been investigating for years. "Good," Razor said simply. Some chapters needed to be closed with finality, and Snake's imprisonment would ensure that the Brotherhood's attention remained focused on problems that didn't involve Millfield or the people who had become Razor's chosen family. Tom Bradley joined them as they were finishing breakfast, his general store showing the kind of modest prosperity that came from serving a community that was no longer in decline. "Got someone asking about you at the store," he told Razor, his expression carrying curiosity mixed with concern. "Law enforcement?" Razor asked, because old habits died hard and unexpected visitors still triggered defensive reactions. "Young woman, maybe mid-20s, said she was looking for Vince Delaney, heard he might be living in Millfield. I told her I didn't know anyone by that name, but she left this." Tom handed Razor a folded piece of paper, and even before opening it, something about the careful handwriting made his chest tight with recognition and hope. The message was brief but contained enough information to confirm what he'd hardly dared to believe. "Dad, if this is really you, I'll be at the diner on Sunday at noon. I know it's been a long time, but I'd like to talk. Amy." The words blurred. As Razor read them a second time, his hands trembling with emotions he'd thought were buried too deep to resurrect. Dr. Chen leaned against his shoulder, reading over his arm with the intimate familiarity that had developed between them. "Your daughter?" she asked softly. "Yeah," Razor managed, his voice rough with the effort of containing years of regret and longing. "Haven't seen her in, God, it's been almost 5 years." The table fell silent as the implications settled over their small group. Amy's arrival would represent either redemption or fresh heartbreak. The possibility of healing wounds that Razor had assumed were beyond repair. But it also meant confronting the man he had been with, the man he had become, explaining choices that had seemed necessary at the time but had cost him the most important relationship in his life. "She found you," Dr. Chen said, her hand covering his with gentle pressure. "After all this time, she found you. That has to mean something." Razor looked around the table at faces that had become dear to him. Miguel's quiet strength, Ruth's maternal warmth, Tom's stubborn integrity, and Dr. Chen's healing presence. 6 months ago, he had been a man with nothing to lose, drifting through a landscape of his own making. Now he had everything to lose, which made him vulnerable in ways he'd forgotten were possible. But vulnerability, he was learning, was the price of belonging somewhere. And as chance settled against his legs with the contented sigh of a dog who knew she was exactly where she belonged, Razor realized that some prices were worth paying regardless of the risk. Sunday was still 3 days away, but for the first time in years, Vince Razor Delaney was looking forward to a conversation that might finally allow him to stop running from the man he used to be and embrace the man he had chosen to become. Outside, the desert stretched toward distant horizons that no longer called to him with promises of escape. Home, he had discovered, wasn't a destination you rode toward. It was a choice you made about where to stop running and who to stop running with. And in this small town that refused to die, surrounded by people who had seen his worst reputation and chosen to believe in his capacity for something better, Razor had finally found both.